Welcome, my friends, again to what is now my fifth YouTube video. This is, for me, going to be one of the most difficult because it goes far more in depth than some of the others do in certain ways, and it's such a vast subject you could spend most of your life. Neighbour's dog, sorry. I think I'm going to get interruptions during this. Oh dear. First thing I must do is thank my hopefully new friend. Forgive that. Is a gentleman across the pond, as he would say, who calls himself Uncle Reggae. He's a ukulele and I believe guitar tutor. And I came across him because I'm hoping to acquire a ukulele, and he's looked at my other videos and very kindly has given me a little bit of advertisement on his own YouTube channel. So thank you, Uncle Reggae, for that. It's much appreciated, and I have put the link on my Facebook page to your video there. This is essentially, at my own sort of quite basic level, is going to be a look at what you might term manifestation, or what this all is. What is it? It's not what many people think it is. So I think one or two people, if they do follow this video through, don't know how long it's going to take, a short while maybe, Uncle sorry, I couldn't resist laughing. Anyway, enough said. I don't know how long it'll take. We need to think about what matter actually is, and it's quite interesting when you get into it more technically. We tend to think that everything, quite correctly, all material things are made of atoms and subatomic particles, and there is the temptation that most of us fall prey to, certainly unless you're a physicist. There is a temptation to think that subatomic particles and atoms are actual lumps of something. They are analogous to an unbelievably minute planetary system like our solar system, in that you have in the solar system the sun, around which planets. You can tell my brain's not in gear today. Around which planets orbit, and of course the planet, all the planets in this system and the sun are, forgive the expression, but lumps of something. They are what we regard as physical matter, although the sun, of course, most people think of it as a ball of hot gas, although there is far more to it than that. I'm going to have dogs barking and aircraft because I'm near a Heathrow flight path, so apologies for extraneous noises. If you just think momentarily about a permanent magnet, well, I'm sure most of us have played with magnets. Imagine that my hand there is a permanent magnet, okay? And if you could actually see the magnetic field, you would see lines of force around and going through the metal of the magnet, or ferrite, whatever it is. You would see the lines of force, and you can actually prove to yourself that they are there. If you get another magnet with the opposite pole, like a north to south, they will attract. If you have north to north or south to south, they will repel, and you've got to push them together. If you get a piece of many forms of metal, they will just stick to the magnet, okay? And you can see that there's an influence at work there. But how many people have actually said, and I've said it myself in the distant past, well, I won't believe it until I see it. That magnetic field, you can prove it's there. You can't see it, hear it, smell it, touch it, or taste it. Your 5 basic senses cannot detect that magnetic field. You can prove it's there. So, you know, you don't have to see everything. In fact, you won't be able to see everything that is physically around you. This is, as you can tell, I'm working this out as I go along, so it's going to be a bit erratic in time, so I ask you to bear with me on this. It's a very complex subject. And it's taken me many years to get to this point of understanding that I'm at now, which I believe to be basically correct. Now, the magnetic field around a magnet, if you can imagine that magnetic field itself billions of times smaller, unbelievably tiny, and without the body of a magnet, just the magnetic field itself, that's essentially what the subatomic particles are. They're a different shape to a conventional magnetic field around a permanent magnet. It's not that shape at all, but it is a magnetic field with set lines of force in quite a complex pattern. An electron is like a tiny little magnetic field, and within protons and within neutrons you get combinations of particles which are like electrons. In both of them, protons and neutrons, you get those that might be regarded as positively charged and negatively charged. In the proton there is an excess of what we might call negatively charged particles in there. See, I told you the brain wasn't working. In a proton there's an excess of positively charged particles, and there's only one, the same size as an electron, excess positive, which is why a single electron can balance it. In the neutron there's the same number of sub-particles, but they're arranged in position relative to each other so that the external field cancels out, so it's actually neutral. But the point is, in each atom you're dealing with a combination of anything from one or two, like a hydrogen atom with one proton and one electron, up to heavy elements like uranium, plutonium. I can't remember the numbers, but that have hundreds of protons and equivalent electrons, in each atom. And then there are millions of atoms in every cubic centimetre of material. And because you're using a body which is made of the same stuff, relative to your hand, materials feel physical. But in absolute terms, they're not physical. In fact, as you will see as you go through this, as we go through this, that despite the fact that we're living on a planet which weighs trillions of tons, and you have many planets in this system, of course, but you also have the Sun itself, thousands of times bigger than the Earth, and you go out into the galaxy. There are billions of planetary systems in this galaxy, and this galaxy is not a particularly big one compared to some of them, and there are billions of galaxies, and there are red giants and white dwarfs and black holes. They love their colours, don't they? And despite the fact that there is so much in the whole cosmos, if you could travel out there and you could go anywhere you liked, you would not find one single solitary particle of physical matter anywhere. There isn't any. It's an illusion, because it's magnetic fields. The whole thing, the whole cosmos, is not governed so much by gravity, it's governed by electromagnetic forces. And again, science is beginning to realize this. And of course, a magnetic field has no substance to it. It is a field of influence. That is the mantra for this video. Field of influence. That's all. No physical matter at all anywhere. Trillions upon quadrillions at all scales of magnetic fields which are just patterns of influence, and that's all the whole thing is. We're going to go down to an even more basic level than that in a moment. When you have vibration, shaking vibration, oscillation, periodic movement, particularly when it's very fast, you can also have, as the musician will know, harmonics and octaves of that vibrational frequency. And in fact we have. because in the space occupied by this Earth and its immediately surrounding part of space, there isn't just this world that you see around you now, but here in this space there are 7 quite natural planes, realms or physical worlds, all occupying the same space, and you can think of it as being like octaves of this plane. You can think of this world as being the fundamental, and in the same space interpenetrating each other, all 7 interpenetrate the same space here, not down there or up there, they're here in the same space, interpenetrating, and each plane or realm is vibrating in a different range of frequencies. I don't know if you can see it in the camera, can you? Yeah, but just like the octaves on a musical keyboard, if you look at the white note, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and it goes up, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and it goes up in octaves. So it is with the matter that makes up this world. You'll have a range of frequencies making up the matter of this world, but that frequency range continues, and it goes back to the beginning again, but an octave higher. And so you have 7 completely different octaves of matter occupying the same space at the same time, here and now. And when people, in inverted commas, die, you don't actually cease to exist. This is what I mentioned in the other video, and I'm not going to dwell at length on it, just mention it in passing. This is analogous to the cars which are in the street. And each car has a driver in it. At least one person, probably several, but at least one person driving the car. The car and the driver move together, but they are not the same thing. The driver can stop the car, get out, walk away, the car sits motionless, the driver walks off. Exactly the same with this. It comes to the end of its useful life like a car does. At the end of its useful life, you stop the body, you get out, and you look at yourself and you're still real to yourself. What you have done is you have shifted your mental consciousness and you have moved into a different frequency range of matter. And the matter around you then is just as physical to you there as this is here. You see, it's all relative. It's all to do with perception, how you perceive it. We perceive this as being physical, but it's to do with perception rather than an absolute definition. But we're talking about magnetic fields that make up everything. But is there a surrounding medium? Well, yes, there is. You see, one of the quandaries that some scientists have faced, and I think they're beginning to wise up a little bit now, and I'm not criticizing them, honest, I'm a fan of science, I love science, but that is, you hear people, especially those connected with space, saying, well, of course, space is a vacuum. When you think about it, space can't be a vacuum. As the metaphysical student would say, a vacuum yearns to be filled. You know, it would draw anything around into itself. You can't have a vacuum under normal natural conditions. I don't know whether it would, but one can imagine that if it was a true vacuum, it would pull the atmosphere off the Earth and spread it out more thinly. I don't know if it would do that, but there's a temptation to think that. But space is not a vacuum now. In fact, the whole of space is filled with one single, note this, because it's not a guess. This has been known for hundreds of thousands of years on the Earth. The whole of space, the whole of the cosmos, including the space where you are, including the space your body is occupied, or where your body is occupied, all of that space, all of it, as far as you can go into space, it's all filled with one, and I'll say substance with a little tiny s and huge inverted commas because it's not the right word, but that word will do for the moment. It's filled with one thing, one field of influence. Now, again, I'm not knocking science in any stretch of the imagination, but when you go back to the medieval times, the Middle Ages, the philosophers and I've forgotten the word. This is when you're getting old. It's annoying when you forget words. The alchemist, I was trying to think of the word, the alchemist would talk about the, first of all, the four elements, and you've heard of earth, air, fire and water. But all of those four are composed of a fifth, which is ether. And as we got into Victorian times, so-called educated man, as science was growing, decided it was wise to take ether out of science because it belonged to the time of the alchemist. And now they're having to put it back because they're beginning to realize the alchemist was right. There is ether. And in fact, everything is ether. There isn't anything in the whole cosmos except ether. Ah, you'll say, yes, but there are chemical elements and compounds and plasmas and, yes, but just a minute. If you stand on the edge of a lake or on the seashore and you're watching ripples coming into the shore, lapping on the shore of the lake or coming on the seashore, has been a big white frothy waves coming in. You can see individual waves coming in, and you can watch a particular wave that rises up, comes in, disappears, and you can watch them individually. The only reason you can see an individual wave, bearing in mind that the water in the wave is the same substance as the water underneath it, but the motion on the top is different. And it's not so much water that you're seeing, it's patterns of movement that you're seeing. It's the movement of the water which forms the wave, not the substance that it is, if you know what I mean. It's motion that's important, movement. And this field of ether, which fills the whole cosmos, can be stirred into motion, and I'll come to how in a moment. It can be stirred into motion so that we, as we are now, for example, will perceive differences in motion. Here is my little trackball. The air here, I don't know where my H is. Don't laugh. The air here is all the molecules, the gas molecules, are all vibrating continuously and extremely fast. But the motion that they have is different to the atoms in here. And we can see the difference in the motion. This is ether in one motion, and the air is ether in a different motion. This is ether in a different motion again. And it's motion that we perceive. Now, if you had, for example, I've got one here. Oops. I was going to say a drinking glass, but I've actually got a bottle of water here. You can see, don't make sure it doesn't come out. Within that transparent bottle, I don't know if you can see it on the camera, you can see there's water in there. If I could hold that perfectly still, that water to my normal eyesight would appear to be absolutely stationary. It just wouldn't move, it would just sit there unless I cause movement in it. The ether is exactly the same. If it's left to its own devices, so to speak, it doesn't move. It becomes static. And this is why space appears empty, because in the bit that appears empty you can't perceive any movement. But it's there, and space is absolutely full of ether, but you can't see it when it doesn't move. And that is why space is not a vacuum, it's filled with ether. It isn't completely empty. What causes ether to move? Because something does, otherwise none of this would exist. Okay, we're now going to go up a step. Consciousness, in its highest state of existence, is not what we would call physical. It's not dependent on any of this to exist. It exists independent of anything in the manifested cosmos. And non-physical consciousness is what some people call spirit. I'm trying to use the words as correctly as I can, because the word spirit is very misused in certain quarters, as indeed are many other words, and I try and keep my terminology as correct as I can, and if I can avoid Sanskrit terminology I will, and I will use English terminology that most of us can understand. If I was talking about the Antakarana, some people would know what I mean. A lot of people who maybe watch this video don't know what the Antakarana is, you know, and so I stay away with some of the terminology that people wouldn't know, understand, unless they've done certain homework beforehand. Yes, what causes ether to move? Well, consciousness in its highest state is not physical, and that is what we call spirit. It has an ability, consciousness, to use an influence that affects directly ether, and that influence is what we call will power. W-I-L-L, will. The power of will power. Consciousness can affect ether through the use of willpower. It can will motion into ether. Let's just sidetrack again, and you'll find I might do this from time to time, because I'm working my route through this as it occurs to me. There are certain passages in one of the big holy books that's been around for centuries in different forms. There's one of the passages which actually describes the so-called creation of whatever. It's known as the creation account. I've just thought of one more thing to throw in before I mention that. Ether is very much like water. It's like a higher octave of water, in that the water, if it's left to itself, will just sit still unless you make it move. It can be put under pressure, so you have a higher pressure here and a lower pressure there. As you know, under the ocean it goes to a higher pressure as you go lower down. It can transmit vibrations like sound underwater. It can transmit lower frequency on the surface of water. You get ripples, but of course in the cosmos there is no surface, you know, that we're aware of, you know, because you can't find the edge of it, you know, so we don't know about ripples, but it will transmit vibrations, like for example sound. And water, like when you've got a fish tank, you know, you can't see it there, but you know there are bubbles in the water. And each of those air bubbles in the water, or in your fish tank when the water is being aerated, the density of the air bubble is less than the density of the water, and yet the air bubble has no problems moving through the higher density water. Many of these characteristics are similar to ether, except ether is on a much higher level of subtlety. It's like a higher octave of water. Okay, I have to mention that because of the biblical statement that has confused people for centuries. If you read the creation account, there is a stage in the process where it says the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And if you read the account, at that point God hasn't yet created anything. So people have said, well, what waters? There isn't any water. Let's rephrase it so that you do understand what it means. The Spirit of God, the non-physical consciousness spirit, which is that creative force behind the cosmos, okay, moved or caused motion in the water-like ethers, the ethers which were already there, okay, and those ethers were static. So if you could have seen it or been present, which of course is impossible, but if you could have been, it would appear empty, dark, silent and cold. And there would have been nothing, no motion, no light, no sound and no warmth, because what we call cold is its natural state. But the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. The face means the bit that you see. You know, this is the face of the bottle, or the face of a cube, you know, the bit that you see. So it was the ethers that if you were there you could have seen. God caused motion in the water-like ethers, and that's what it meant. It's a metaphysical statement. Now, some of you, like myself, I was trained in electronics, may be familiar with basic physics, and there are a number of triangles and different shapes where they put letters or names on the corners, and it shows you how different things relate to each other. One of the simple ones is with electrical theory, and you have three values of voltage, current and resistance. Anyone who's got into electricity will know about Ohm's law. And you have voltage at the top, resistance and current at the bottom. You know, voltage is current multiplied by resistance. Resistance is voltage divided by current. Current is voltage divided by resistance. And using the triangle, it shows you how the three relate to each other. When any motion at all is initiated in any form whatsoever in ether, there are always two byproducts, and that movement, or any movement, and the two byproducts are completely inseparable. You cannot have any one on its own. You always have the three, and the two byproducts are light and sound. Light, sound and movement cannot be separated. Light and sound are movement. You know, the very nature of their movement. And all light has sound associated with it. All sound has light associated with it. There is sunlight, fortunately at the moment, not coming directly through the window, but I have some reflected sunlight coming through the window here, which is why I've sat this way round this afternoon. But if you had a certain degree of clear hearing, clear audience, and you were in this room, you could possibly, as some people can, tune into that light and you could hear it, because it does produce sound. The man I regard as my teacher, Sir George King, who was a Western master of yoga, actually said that one of the sounds he's heard, which wasn't very pleasant, was when he switched on a fluorescent light. And he was a master of yoga, I mean an absolute master. And he said that when you switch the fluorescent light on, he could hear the light come out of the fluorescent light. And it's a zap, you know, very unpleasant sound. Although it's not to do with this, but just talking about sound, he said one of the most beautiful sounds he's ever heard is the sound of grass growing. And it's like millions and millions of very high-pitched tinkling bells. A beautiful sound to listen to. And grass actually makes that noise because it's moving. You know, and therefore it causes sound. All movement causes sound. And all light... it's easy to get lost, so bear with me. Okay. The light coming in through the window produces sound. The sound that I am making now by pulsing air through my vocal cords and my mouth, etc., and it is being picked up by this microphone. If someone was in the room and they had a degree of sensitivity in terms of what we generally call psychic sight, clear vision, clairvoyance, they would be able to see colours and geometric shapes travelling away from me in relation to the sound that I'm producing. The sound has light associated with it. The light has sound associated with it. You cannot separate light and sound. They're always, always, always together. Even though the light you might not be able to see it. The sound you might not be able to hear it. But it is still light and sound. So that just takes you back to another statement in the Bible which is not generally understood. It's often quoted but generally not understood. There's a phrase where hypothetically God is supposed to have said, "Let there be light." You can imagine this creative consciousness, in inverted commas, looking, because it doesn't have eyes, as it were, into the cosmos in the first instant when nothing is moving and it's dark. So by symbolically saying let there be light, what you're actually saying is let there be movement which causes light. which is what that means. And of course, the other one which is mentioned, I don't quote the Bible that much, but what is mentioned in Revelation by John, in the beginning was the Word. If you, again, had that degree of clear audience, clear hearing, and you consciously tuned in to what the scientists call the solar wind, which is made up of what is known in Eastern philosophy, depending on which country you come from, as chi, ki, prana, universal life forces. This is very subtle magnetic fields, very specific magnetic fields, which are being issued by the sun all the time, and some of it immediately leaves the sun, interacts with other types of vibration around the sun, and forms atoms immediately, ionized atoms, and we get plasma and ionized gases. And this is the energy coming out from the sun. If you were to listen, as we would say, psychically to the sun, you would hear this. Now, there are two versions of the word. The group of people I am connected with, we never, in conversation, say the word, just out in conversation. Because if you're a spiritual person, this is the holiest sound you can make. It's above normal conversation. But we refer to the sound that the sun makes by a group of three letters. A-U-M. A-U-M. And that A-U-M, imagine a word spelt A-U-M, but don't say it. Don't say it. But just think of it, the word, letters, A-U-M. Some people in India and such places, you mention it, and they'll say, oh, you mean that, and they'll say it. Bad move. Never say it. It's above conversation. And there is a shortened version which is known as the O-M. The O-M. Okay? And you can vocalize your, the human representation of the sound of this energy going out from the sun. The sound, we know about some of the light coming out from the sun, because some of it we can see, some of it we can measure, ultraviolet and whatever with instrumentation. So we know there is light coming out from the sun, and now you know there is sound coming out from the sun, but it's not within the range of your ears. So you won't hear it with normal hearing. But you can hear it when you tune in the right way. Okay, pause. So we know that the sound and the light is issued from the sun. So the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters and said, let there be light, let there be movement, and the ether started to move. God used willpower to influence ether to cause it to move. Now, if you can imagine, and this is as far into it as I can go because it's very complex, if you think about ether as being a substance, which technically it isn't, but we think of it like a substance. Like any substance, it has certain characteristics, things it can do, things it can't do, which is why I cringe sometimes when people say, well, anything is possible. No, anything is possible within certain rules, certain guidelines. There are things outside of that that cannot happen. It's not an infinitely variable universe, but it's a tremendously wide spectrum, but it's not infinite. In the real sense, in absolute terms, it isn't, because ether can only do certain things. Within that vast field of ether, there are certain potentials that can be brought into manifestation. There are things that you can make the ether do, and things that it can't do. Okay? And anything that ether can do can be done anywhere in ether. Anywhere. Throughout the whole cosmos. From your basement down here to Proxima Centauri. It doesn't matter where you go. The same patterns of potential apply in ether everywhere in the cosmos. And if you imagine the pattern of potential which is within ether, which is, as it were, lying dormant, excuse me, to a large extent, that can be tapped. It can be activated so that ether suddenly does something within its potential to do that. There is a word for the pattern of potential which exists within ether. And this is going to surprise somebody, and the nearest, most correct term for that is mind. You see, there are people, again, I'm not knocking science, but there are people in the scientific movement who haven't yet been able to sort out the difference between the brain and mind. I've got radio equipment, I'm a licensed radio ham, I've got radio equipment here. Radio equipment using an aerial picks up on electromagnetic waves that are passing, are picked up by the aerial and converted in the radio receiver to sound, or in television to a picture, etc. The patterns of potential in ether or mind are available everywhere, no matter where you go. Part of the functionality of the brain, like a mental radio receiver, is to pick up on those potentials within mind that are within its frequency range. You know, like a radio receiver tuned to the medium wave, and you won't pick up anything on VHF because it's out of the frequency range. So your brain, excuse me, your brain might be different to my brain. And you're probably nodding and say, yeah, you bet your life on that. So my brain, like a mental radio receiver, can pick up on certain patterns of potential, some of which manifest as what I call thoughts. But those thoughts are not originating in the brain any more than radio 1 is originating in the radio receiver. You know, it isn't. It's out there, but it's being picked up. The potential, the mind, is out there, but it flows through all things, and the brain can pick some of it up. Okay? So there is a pattern of potential in the ether called mind. And consciousness, using willpower, can influence the pattern of potential, the mind, in ether, and cause it to vibrate into fixed patterns of motion. In a similar way that, again, with radio wave and with radio waves and with sound. Many of you will know about sound. If you're familiar with acoustics, you will know that there are 2 different types of sound vibration, in as much as you can have a radiating sound wave, like the voice emanations that are coming from me now. It's a radiating pattern, and it's going out until it loses energy and eventually disappears. It's a travelling wave of sound in the air. So you have travelling waves. If there is some circumstance where the sound being produced is contained within some sort of container, and the size, the specifications of that containment bear a relationship to the frequency of the sound, you can actually have the sound just bounce backwards and forwards, and it will change, vibrate in an exact relationship with the size of this containment, and you basically have what's called a standing wave. This is how a singer can shatter a glass, because they can produce a travelling, say a shrill note with their voice, and it's a travelling wave and it goes out, but it causes the glass to vibrate, but within the glass a standing wave builds up, and every time the wave vibrates the glass, more vibrations are still coming, and so the vibration gets bigger and bigger until the glass can't take it anymore and it shatters. So you have a travelling wave which causes a standing wave in the glass. So you have travelling waves and you have contained standing waves. The patterns of vibration, which we call electrons, protons and neutrons, are packets, if you like, small collections, packets of standing wave patterns. Because although an electron might be going round its nucleus, if you could see the electron it's essentially the same shape all the time, because it's this pattern of standing waves, you see. And yet light, sound, radio waves are travelling waves, and so you've got two different types of vibration. Okay, just come back again, and I'm going to clarify something that has mystified a lot of people. What I'm about to say now has originally, genuinely, come from extraterrestrials who do physically live on other planets in this solar system. The man I regard as my teacher, Sir George King, was a Western master of yoga. When he passed away from us in 1997, had had 43 years of well-documented contact with real extraterrestrials who do physically live on planets in this system, real beings, all of whom, all the humanoid ones of whom, are millions of years senior to us in evolution. And they passed a tremendous amount of information through him to us, available to everyone. Most of it is not secret, it's available to everyone. And this is some of what we were told by people who actually do know and have instrumentation, the like of which we can't begin to imagine. And they can measure these things, so they know what they're saying is correct. Okay, come back to Earth. I worked at London's Natural History Museum. Sorry about it darts backwards and forwards, but you'll see. I'll draw it all together for you. I worked at London's Natural History Museum for 9 years. Not in a scientific role, I was a security warder on the galleries. But as such, I went behind the back of house, and I met professional scientists. I made friends with one or two. But the one thing is, I knew exactly where they were coming from. I understand what they were saying, and I understand why. Let's just say some of the things they believed could have been updated a little bit. And one of the things I sometimes got criticised for, wrongly, was the use of terminology. And I have to say this, one of the reasons why you have, for example, the spiritualists who don't agree with the theosophists, who don't agree with Orthodox Christians, who don't agree with Buddhists, who don't agree with Muslims, and very often they're talking about the same thing, but they're using different words, or they're using the same words to mean different things. You cannot have a common understanding until you make each word have a specific meaning. Then the other person knows what you're referring to. Okay? One of the words which has been so misused over the centuries is dimension or dimensions. If you go on YouTube and you look at some of the videos containing supposed, note that, supposed information from extraterrestrials, they will make comments like, of course this alien comes from a different dimension, or they are multi-dimensional beings, we're now moving into the fifth dimension. I mean, it's nonsense. What is a dimension? A dimension is something which is measurable. Is a ruler. It measures one of the dimensions, and it can be length, length, breadth, height, depending on which orientation it's in. There's another measuring instrument for one of the dimensions. A dimension is something which is measurable. This mentions what we call time. Okay? Time is a dimension. It's the fourth dimension. There's nothing complex about it. I'm not mentioning any mathematics, and I'm going to give you a phrase in a moment because of the information given through Sir George King from real extraterrestrials, which describes exactly the 7 basic dimensions within which we all live. And it's not guesswork, it's how it is, and you don't need any mathematics to understand it. Okay. Let's just go over this several times, but I'm going to phrase it slightly differently each time because I want to steer your thoughts in a certain direction. When the cosmos was first brought into being, as far as we can understand it, non-physical consciousness or spirit that we call, for want of a better term, God, used visualization It used its willpower to cause movement in the ethers, the water-like ethers, which were already there, but had no movement in them. When you have motion, it is something which is changing in length, breadth, height over time. You know, it's simple. So we're now going to look at the 7 dimensions within which we all live, and you'll find it childishly simple compared with some of the complex mathematics that dear old Albert Einstein and his colleagues thought about when they were here. I remember my teacher saying, poor old Einstein, he was so close and yet so far away, but he's learnt better since he passed on, you know. And he's mixed with real scientists. I love that. Okay, so from here, we are existing in 3 dimensions of length, breadth and height. But every single aspect of what you are and what is around you is changing through time. Microsecond by microsecond, it's in continual motion. And therefore you have movement through time. Length, breadth and height through time. It's quite straightforward, there's nothing complex. Some people would say that the next dimension, the 5th dimension, would be motion. I'm going to briefly skip over this, but when I come back in the other direction you'll see why. I'm not going to use the term motion, I'm going to use the term directed motion, and you'll see why. Directed motion of what? Of the ethers, yes, but it's directed motion within the field of potential, the field of mind, which exists within the ethers. And it's affected by will, which is an influence exerted by consciousness. So to come back down the 7 dimensions from 7 to 1, and you'll see how simple it is. Will imposes those conditions upon mind which bring its potential into manifestation as directed motion in a time frame of length, breadth and height. And it's that simple. If the ethers are left to themselves, or the mind energy, mind field is left to itself, there is no movement. So the mind patterns cannot come into manifestation. The potential remains potential. And it's only when consciousness uses willpower that mind, which is the potential within ether, can be activated and come into what we would call physical manifestation. Therefore, everything in the whole cosmos, from the smallest subatomic particle to the greatest collection of galaxies, is what it is and is doing what it is, because consciousness is using willpower to make it that. Everything has intelligence behind it at all levels. Because without the intelligence, the consciousness, the willpower, there is no movement. And nothing that you can see except there is static ether that you can't perceive, and therefore the space appears empty. So I think that really makes it a lot easier to understand. I'm just trying to think if I need to backtrack. Let me just check, because I haven't seen the time. Oh, how long is that? Okay, it's 49 minutes. Dear, dear, dear. It's very tiny lettering on the screen. I couldn't see it. Shows you, you know. And I said my last talk was going to be short. I think I've done enough. Okay, I'll leave it at that. But if you've got any questions, email me. My website is labaker, labaker.net. So you can go to my website, you can email me from there. There are links to email me from. I won't say my email address, although it really doesn't matter. It's just my own first name at my domain name, which is Leslie with an IE at labaker.net. Email me if you've got any questions, subscribe if you like, and make any comments below. But I think I've said enough, otherwise I'm going to go into more than an hour. and this is already long enough. I really thank you for sitting through this, and I hope it's been of some interest to you. And okay, I was going to joke and say may the force be with you. I better not. Cheers, my friend, and thank you very much indeed for putting up with me for this period of time.